I'm Kelly Nagle. Today's conversation on Here's the Problem is with civil rights activist and internationally recognized sports and social justice expert, Dr. Richard Lapchick. Dr. Lapchick has not only witnessed history, he's helped to write it. I talk with Dr. Lapchick about his introduction to racism as a child of a Hall of Fame NBA coach, his lifelong friendship with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and the violent consequences of his activism against apartheid in South Africa. It is a conversation that will motivate you to get off the sidelines when it comes to addressing social justice. Enjoy. Welcome, Dr. Richard Lapchick. It is a privilege to have you joining us on Here's the Problem podcast today.
Thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to it.
So your credentials are impressive. You are the director of the DeVos Sport Business Management Program at University of Central Florida. You're the director of the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sport, and you're the president of the Institute for Sport and Social Justice, among many others, such as author and civil rights activist. So again, privileged to have you here. And I'd love to just start with, how did you start with building a life and a career at the intersection of sports and social justice?
Well, it goes way back. Literally, when I was 5 years old, I looked outside my bedroom window in Yonkers, New York, where I was being raised, and saw my father's image swinging from a tree with people under the tree picketing. And for several years after that, I'd pick up the extension phone in our house and hear racial epithet after racial epithet being hurled at him. As a 5, 6, and 7-year-old, I had no idea what it was all about, except that a lot of people hated my best friend. And I grew up, as I got older, I was able to appreciate that what it was about was, as the coach of the New York Knicks, he had signed the first African-American player in the history of the NBA, Nat Sweetwater Clifton, a week before the NBA draft that year, when Syracuse drafted Earl Lloyd and the Celtics drafted Chuck Cooper, and they became the first 3 black players. The league is now 80% black, but in 1950, there were a lot of people in this country who didn't want it to become that. They wanted an all-white league. And after that, you know, he was also a Hall of Fame basketball player and coach, so everybody told me I would be. It was something that sounded good to me, so I worked on my game as a young person. I was pretty good up until in the 8th grade. I was one of the tallest players in New York City, and I was heavily recruited by a lot of the schools that played top-level basketball, but I did not choose the one that was the number one, which was Power Memorial High School in New York. But I became friends with the coach, and he invited me to a summer camp. He was starting in 1961. In 1961, there were no coaches having camps even at the college level. Now they're very commonplace as income earners, but in 1961 was unusual. There were 5 other white guys at the camp and a black guy. They were all his players at Power Memorial. One of the white guys was dropping the N-word on the black guy from dawn till dusk for the first 3 days till I finally challenged him. He knocked me out cold. The black guy's name at the time was Lou Alcindor, and of course became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and a lifelong friendship was about to begin. It became so profound that when his statue was unveiled at the Staples Center, he asked me to be a speaker at that event. When he was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Barack Obama at the end of his administration, he asked me and Henry Louis Gates to be his 2 guests. And when I was scheduled to have surgery here in Orlando, all the way across the country, he flew to Orlando to be with me. But what was important for me as a 15-year-old white guy coming from a largely white community is I suddenly had a young urban African-American lens with which to look at his community and other communities of color and to see what racism was doing close up. And I decided that I would spend the rest of my life working in the area of civil rights. I didn't know what that meant as a 15-year-old, but I knew that's what I wanted to do. I ended up getting a PhD in international race relations. It was literally the first such degree in the country. And I did my doctoral dissertation on how South Africa used sport as part of its foreign policy and the international response, and compared it to how the Nazis had done that in the 30s. It got published as a book. I started speaking about South Africa at the time. I was a professor at a college in Virginia, and formed the sports boycott of South Africa in the United States. South Africa, for those of in your audience who don't know what apartheid was, it was the most racist system of government on the face of the earth in the second half of the 20th century. Yep. If you were a person of color, and 81% of the people were, you couldn't own land, you couldn't vote, you couldn't get the education you were there to simply serve the white economy, which was a very wealthy white economy. And the entire global community came together to try to strangle South Africa and to bring the regime down by an oil boycott, a trade boycott, a bank loan boycott, and a sports boycott. Well, they could smuggle in trade, they could smuggle in oil, they could smuggle in currency, but they couldn't play sports in the dark, and it was a sports-mad country, so it became South Africa's Achilles heel. Well, I mean, in terms of the racial reckoning, we've seen the elevation of athlete activism to a height that I've been only dreaming about in my lifetime. I'm friends with John Carlos and Tommy Smith, who were the protesters in Mexico City. My wife and I have been good friends with Muhammad and Lonnie Ali from the late 1970s on until he passed several years ago, and still friends with Lonnie. And, they faced terrible consequences for their actions. Carlos and Smith didn't get a job for 7 years. Ali faced 5 years in prison. When Colin Kaepernick took a knee in 2016, I think most of the American public disapproved of that. And I said to my wife that day that this will be Colin Kaepernick's last season. And of course, it turned out that way. These athletes are now acting in unison. I think that the fact that Donald Trump, on the beginning of the 2017 NFL season, when it was not clear how many athletes would be protesting that year, said at a rally somewhere in the Midwest, I think, that I hope that these owners of the NFL team will fire anybody who kneels during the national anthem. He was a little more colorful in his language than that. But that set off the commissioner of the NFL, as well as the coaches and owners and players of the NFL, to have mass demonstrations. And I think Donald Trump contributed to athlete activism in a way that he certainly didn't intend to. So this year, as we saw the symbolism of Black Lives Matter in all of our sports arenas, on the uniforms, on athletes speaking out. And I think the most important act of athlete activism since Carlos and Smith and Ali took place when the Milwaukee Bucks decided not to come out for a playoff game during the NBA playoffs because of a shooting that had taken place in Kenosha, Wisconsin, not far from where they play in Milwaukee. And the rest of the league shut down within an hour, as well as the Players Association. 24 hours later, all of pro sport was completely stopped.
For our students in particular who are really passionate about social justice, how would you recommend someone getting involved and maybe not following in your specific footsteps, but who can follow in a career path, dedicating their life to social justice, particularly through sports?
Well, I think that they should, if they're white students, should be listening to their Black fellow students and brown fellow students to learn about what their lives are really like, as opposed to what they might imagine. To read, there's so much great literature out there now, and videos and movies on racial justice and social justice. So to keep the learning process going in their years while they're formally in school, but also after they finish school, to find an organization that appeals to them in terms of the mission of the organization locally, wherever they are students, maybe to volunteer for that organization, see what it's like. If they their family has the resources, one of the hardest things to do for groups that have been fighting against racism is to raise money. So to get their families to help financially support some of those social justice organizations. And mainly what I would tell them is, don't sit on the sidelines. Everybody can't be on the front lines, but everybody's got to be off the sidelines.
I'd like to thank Dr. Richard Lapchick for joining me today and sharing his incredible personal and professional journey into sports and social justice. I'd also like to thank all those who made this podcast possible. Our wonderful production team, the George Milton Group, Winnie the Moog for our theme song, and my Teen Think Tank Project co-founder, Matthew DeSantis. Most importantly, I'd like to thank you, the listener. Let us know you're listening. Subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Follow the podcast at problem_pod. For more information on today's topic, or to find out more about social justice programming for exceptional teens, please follow the Teen Think Tank Project at teen_think tank. Until next week, I'm Kelly Nagle.